Welcome to the DrupalCon Europe 2020 presentation about the Configuration Management Initiative. I am Fabian Bircher. I'm a senior developer at Nuvole. You can find me on Twitter, even though I'm not super active there, or on my Drupal.org profile. I work for Nuvole, which is a distributed team in Italy, Belgium, the Czech Republic. And we have a lot of international organizations as our clients and institutions. And so we needed like a fast development process, and often we change configuration and needed to be very good and reliable already since Drupal 6 days. So my colleagues in Nuvole were pioneers with the configuration management in early days, and you can find old blog posts and slides on the internet. Today I have a co-presenter, which is Moshe Weitzman. He's an architecture consultant. You can find him on Twitter. He tweets much more than me, very interesting stuff. And Moshe Weitzman on Drupal.org, one of the very low user IDs you will find. So I'm glad to have him as a co-speaker today.
Everyone.
The Configuration Management Initiative, the first version when Drupal 8 was developed, was one of the signature improvements for Drupal 8. We got declarative configuration, and the workflow for the most common need was addressed, which is putting configuration from a development environment or to a staging environment, and then finally deploying it to a production environment. But this was for the same site always, and the same configuration as is, without any modification. So you get all the reliability that we wanted, and it's all the configuration and not just parts of it that you would deploy into features as we did in Drupal 7. So the scope was on purpose relatively narrow, and it was left to contrib to figure out how to solve all the other challenges. Since Drupal 8.8, many of these challenges have been addressed, and in last year's presentation you will find more highlights. So the Configuration Management 2, the Configuration Management Initiative 2, was kind of sprung up because there were lots of these contrib modules that came up and to try to solve different problems or try to solve the same problem in different ways. And the new Configuration Management Initiative, basically the overarching goal is to consolidate these best practices that we now found and put some of it into core to extend kind of the use case that core can handle. We can, for example, now install from configuration. There's still some outstanding issues, but in general, this is now working quite well. In this last year, we had to rescope a little bit of the CMI2 because we want to focus on an achievable goal. And we focus on the environment-specific configuration so that you can have deployment of the same site, but across different environments. Like so on development, you have a development module enabled. On production, you have maybe a different way of logging and so on. And usually you would do that with the configuration overrides in your settings.php, but there's some limitations to that. For example, which modules are enabled. And this is the goal, plus the documentation, of course, of the best practices. And originally, we also had sharing of configuration across multiple sites, so distributions, multi-sites, and so on. But in the past year, or actually in the past 2 years, not much has happened in this space, or a lot has happened, but it hasn't come to the initiative in the sense that nobody comes to our meetings and says we need to do this and has a passion to drive these issues forward. And in particular, we haven't found any consensus on what is the best way to do this with for example, distributions. Like some of the big distributions use the same approaches, but there's not really the one solution that distributions use. And the same for multi-site as well. Of course, distributions, the ones that we can see on Drupal.org are a bit more easy to inspect and to see what they're doing. Most multi-sites are, of course, hidden from public view. And so if someone wants this to be in the scope of CMI2 again, then we need volunteers to step up and take this over. And otherwise, there can be always a configuration management initiative 3, I think, for future versions of Drupal. So the organization for the configuration management initiative, we meet twice a week on the European evening and US morning on Slack. You can find the links on our project page, and it's Alex Pott and me who coordinate it. And yeah, it's basically like most or other initiatives as well, the organization. So then the next part of this presentation is kind of like what we have been focusing on in the last year or so, which is to basically make contrib update to the new core API that we added in 8.8, which I think was really a big success and made the configuration management in Drupal 8 and of course also 9 much better. And since 8.8 is now also end of life, everybody should be able to use this new API. And so the contrib modules have been updated. Interesting to note is for the people who used the config filter before. The config filter was kind of the pre-8.8 way of interacting with the configuration import and export. We've added a new test framework to it so that you can write tests for your module that uses config filter 1.x and also 2.x. So both of the versions of config filter have this test traits. But these test traits also work if your module uses the new core API. So whether you use the config filter plugin or the new core API, the tests are exactly the same. And this is really the added benefit of this is so that you can upgrade from using config filter to the core API, and you know everything works because it's the same test that passes in both scenarios. And basically what you do is you set up your system, like the active configuration and the configuration that is in the sync directory. And then you assert that what is going to be exported is what you expect, or what is going to be imported is what you expect. So rather than importing the configuration during your test, you see what will be imported. And this is important because it's this like framing that you need to have this in your mind, that when the configuration is exported, the active configuration is taken and modified and then written to the file system. And when you import the configuration, the file system configuration is read, then modified, and then imported. And in the Drupal UI, when you when you import a configuration, you see the diff of what is active and what will be imported. You don't see the diff of what is active and what is in the file system, because the file system could be a different configuration when it's altered by config split or config ignore or config all the other modules that use this same framework, or that use config filter, or that use now the core API, or also a mix of both. So you can use config filter and the core API, or modules that use both at the same time. There's some caveats with ordering of the filters, but in general, it should work. The same is, of course, also true with Drush. Drush, when you import or export a configuration, it shows you a diff if you are so inclined. And this diff is also different for import and export, because it shows the diff of what is going to be written to the sync storage, or it shows the diff of what is going to be imported, which may or may not be the same depending on, like if you have config split, some of the configuration will be written into the split folder and therefore will not show up in the diff of the export. But of course it will on the import, because it's part of the config import. I hope this explains a little bit how this works. And I recommend everybody who maintains modules that depend on config filter to use this new test trait. I just noticed now before when I started making this presentation that actually I didn't make a change record where it's like explained on how to use it, but I will do that after the session. Then on to config split. Config split has a 2.x release in beta, which is using the new core API, but is fully feature compatible with the 1.x version. So it uses the same configuration and it should work the same way. I say should because for me it does, but maybe it doesn't for you, and that's why it's not a stable release yet. And also, before it's going to be a stable release, I want to rename the config keys, of course, with the update hook, so that you can use the previous configuration and move it over to config split 2. We will also only be adding new features to config split 2 because some of the feature requests for config split, they were just not possible with the architecture of config filter. But since the new core API allows more things to be done, we can do that. I mean, that was one of the reasons why the new core API is not config filter directly, but it's improved version of it. Then I already know there's going to be lots of questions about config ignore. The 2.x branch has the new test with this new config filter framework. And the 3.x uses the new API, but doesn't have the tests yet, and is not totally feature compatible. But we will make new releases for it soon. And the idea is also to make both of them feature compatible so that you can upgrade from 2 to 3. And then we will add new features to 3 only. There is one about exporting configuration or export filtering of configuration in 2.x that is already in 3. So we will add it to 2 so with the configuration option, and then in 3 we add the configuration option, because in 3 you can currently choose not to ignore the export. But if you have more questions to that, I'm also available later, or in the chat later, and on the config channel on Slack. And then finally, another really fun part of this new configuration management standardization, or like trying to find a common ground, is a new Drush command that Moshe will now talk to you more about. Very exciting.
All right. Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Hopefully you guys can see my screen. I am showing the Drush documentation. So I am the maintainer of Drush, which is the command line tool for Drupal. We added a new command a few months ago that I'm happy about and want everyone to know about. The command is called deploy. And this is like a help topic page that talks about the new deploy command. There's a few use cases for the new command. They all involve configuration management, so that's why we're talking about it here. When you are a developer working on a team and someone on your team has pushed new code to your repo and you pull down the new code to your local, that you might have just pulled down more pending database updates, configuration changes, and deploy hooks, and you need to run those in order to get your database up to date with the code you just pulled. There's a new command that handles that for you. You run Drush deploy locally, and there's a little table here about what Drush deploy actually does. You can see that I've highlighted this text here. These 5 commands here in a particular order are exactly what Drush deploy does. We run all of the pending database updates. That's hook update N and post updates, both of them together in this first step. And then we rebuild all your caches. We run configuration import. We rebuild the caches. And then we run any deploy hooks that might have shown up in that code pull that you just did. So that's all a deployment really is. The real value of this command is that now everyone can run deployments in the same way, in the way that the system has been designed. Let me show, just clarify a little bit. When you're authoring as a developer update hooks, there's actually 3 different kinds of update hooks that are used in 3 different situations. And so just so people understand, hook update N is the most traditional way to write update hooks. The characteristics of these types of hooks are that you're not allowed to use the Drupal API, and the purpose is for low-level changes. Post updates, you are allowed to use the Drupal API, and these run before the config is imported. There's use cases for that. The new type of hooks, hook deploy name, you are allowed to use the Drupal API, and these hooks run after the configuration is imported. So if you need to, if your update is going to create a field and then populate content in that field, your best bet is to create the field as part of configuration import, and then use hook deploy name to populate that field. Okay. That way you can use the field, the entity save API. All right, so let's look at some code. This is code that belongs to one of my projects, one of my clients, the state of Massachusetts, where I live. They have their main website, mass.gov. The website open sourced all its code. And here we have a deploy command, Massachusetts deploy. It's a Drush command. And what this command does is that it runs, it switches the code to go to production. It switches production environments code. Where do I want to be? It turns on maintenance mode. here we go, deploys the new code. Here's the line where we actually run the deploy command that I've been talking about. Here we clear caches. We do some purging at our CDN. And we turn off maintenance mode, log a new deployment, new relic, run all the purges. The point of showing you this is that deployments typically are more than just running Drush deploy. You have to actually run some git commands, maybe some purges and so forth. So the new deploy command certainly simplified part of a deployment, and this is how you wrap it in the other custom things that your site needs. All right, I'll hand back to Fabian now, but great to talk to everyone.
Now I just need to unmute myself. You should be seeing my screen again. So yeah, it's really cool. I think that before we added this to Drush, there was quite a contention about when to run configure imports depending on which update hooks you run, because Drupal developers have been quite used to writing update hooks, and if you want to write, like Moshe said, if you want to write an update hook that adds some values to some fields, then you need to run the update hook after the configuration import, otherwise the field is not there. But configuration import is supposed to be running on a site that has the database in a state that it can run, and because it uses the Drupal API. And the update hooks are made for changing the database into matching with the code. So if you change something in the database, or like the schema changes, and they need to go to hook update n, for example. And yeah, and then some people were like, oh, we can just separate the hook, like the post update after the configuration import. But that's also not a good idea, because if you're writing a module, then you can write hook updates, hook update n and hook post update name in your contrib module to like, depending on whether you need the Drupal API or not. So for example, in a contrib module, you could change the configuration or update it when you change the configuration schema. And so that obviously has to go before the configuration import, because the configuration import will set it to the way the developer has exported it. And so now with this new hook, you have a way of adding it after the configuration import. And also maybe interesting is that this hook is meant for sites. This is meant for when you're developing a particular project. This is not meant to be used in contrib modules, since in a contrib module, you don't know what the deployment is. Like you only know your code runs, and what the Drupal site does with it is not in the module author's power to decide. So as a contrib module author, you should not use the deploy hooks because they're meant to be part of the deployment for a site that you build. The same way the config sync directory belongs, the configuration belongs to the site, and you as a module author, you only ship the initial configuration, and you can use update hooks to change that. So that's the idea behind this. And yeah, as I said before, the overarching goal is to make this more standardized, and this is, I think, a really great way to standardize it, the deployments. So yeah, an important thing for everybody to know, and I think that's what this session is about. Then some outlook for the future. So we also want to change more things in core again. The main thing is still the same that we were talking about already last year and probably the year before. And it's an experimental core module, or at first experimental, of course. The idea is, or the plan is to get it stable at some point. And the basic premise of this is that to allow this more nuanced configuration changes depending on the environment, the same way config split does, but a bit more slimmed down to make sure that the use case is well covered and the core doesn't provide too much tools, because config split can be and is used in many different ways. Some that I had when I wrote the module originally had not intended or thought of, but this is the great value of the Drupal community, is coming up with new ways of using tools, and I think that's great. But for a core module, it needs to not allow too many edge cases, because the edge cases is where you can shoot yourself in the foot. And if you use a tool in a totally different way than it was intended to be used, then yeah, it can be dangerous territory. So, but nonetheless, getting a new module with all its UI and all of the nice shiny things into core is quite a tedious process, or not tedious as such, but it's a long process, and there's many gates and hurdles and hoops to jump through, which is a good thing, because it means the quality of what goes into core is high. But if you're like me and don't have too much time, the luxury of having free time to work on this, then it can take much longer than you originally thought. And Chris, the maintainer of the groups module, had a really great session yesterday talking about kind of like the feelings and what it's like to maintain a module. And I share much of this sentiment. And so the plan for now is to make all of the kind of the UI and the functionality that this new module would need into config split, because I mean, as long as they also make sense for config split, of course, because config split is used by a lot of people. So there will be a lot of people exposed to this new functionality, and we can gather feedback. Of course, I don't want to like make everybody test out things that are broken, but for example, now there's only a Drush command for importing and exporting just the split and not all of the configuration together. But for a core module, it needs to have the same functionality as a UI. I already have some work in progress on my local copy of config split, where the UI kind of already works. I mean, basically, it's copying the config import UI from core, so it's not really anything special. So that also is, of course, to make sure that the accessibility and the UI UX review process for core are going to be easier, or at least I hope, since the UI already exists, then I think the new one that is the same should be easier than to create a completely new one. There's many things that can be improved in this space, of course. But then once config split has most of this functionality, then we create a core module that does this. And then finally, we add it to core as a experimental module or maybe even as a stable module. We will see how this goes. But it's easier to faster commit things outside of core because we can worry about the fine print later, and it doesn't have to be like one big patch. We can iterate much more easily when it's not up to the core committers, which are already overburdened to review every single patch to this new module. But yeah, that's where a lot of help is still needed as well, of course. And then there is still a lot of outstanding issues. In previous sessions, I had like a list with links, but the links are always like changing. There's new issues and some are getting closed. So it's best to just go to the CMI project page, and there is a link to the issue tag. We use the CMI2 candidate, I think, to tag the issues, and I think there's a good list there already. I try to bring them up every once in a while in our contrib, the meeting we have on Slack, and I will have a list of good issues to work on ready on the contribution meeting. I don't know how this will work in a virtual DrupalCon, but in a real DrupalCon, or I mean, this is also a real DrupalCon, but in a DrupalCon where you meet in person, you would go to like the CMI table, and there would be like lots of issues to work on. Like probably the most famous one is that we have installing from configuration for sites. That works great. Like you can export your configuration and start up a new site with this configuration. But there is an important caveat. You cannot use this with profiles that have install hooks, because traditionally install hooks, they could do anything and they would run last. So they could assume that all of the modules are already there that the profile tries to install. But some of the modules that the profile by default installs can be optional, so that you can turn them off. And so when you install from configuration, the modules are not there, and so on. So this issue, there's a workaround, of course, for custom and contrib profiles, but I think this is an issue that we can now address, since this functionality to install from config has been in Drupal versions that are now end of life already. So I think, I mean, if you have a profile that has an install hook, you couldn't use this feature. And yeah, I don't know. There's political discussions to be had about what we should allow and what not, and so on. So your input is also valuable there. Then finally, I want to, before we go to the questions, I want to remind you of the contribution opportunities on Friday. There will be a CMI table as well. I don't know like what time. I try to be in the Zoom channel the whole day, but of course you're welcome to join us there or work on other Drupal issues, of course. And yeah, don't forget to rate this session when you leave, but don't leave yet, because we still have Q&A, I think. I see there's already a couple of questions.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions. So starting with Claudia's question. Hi, it's Alex here. She's asking, is there best practice that should be splitted between different environments? For example, split the site settings. So do you have any opinion on that, Fabian, as maintainer of config split?
Yes. So basically, the best practice, what I would recommend is to use the config overrides in settings.php for all of the things that can be used and that are easy to be used. And when it is an option to write stuff in settings.php. So for example, the site settings is a good example not to split. When you just want to like change the slogan or the email address on the production website. So the splits make most sense if you need to kind of automate changing from like if the changes were made in the UI and you want to save them and split them off so that they survive the next import as kind of like an alternative to config ignore, so that you still have the configuration in the files rather than just plain out ignoring and treating it as if it wasn't a configuration at all. So yeah, that would be my recommendation, is to split the things that you have to split because the values were entered through the UI, or because it's like the color of Bartik that you cannot override, or of course which modules are enabled that you can also not override in settings.php.
Thanks, Fabian. And so we also have a question from Hao, I think that's how you pronounce it, who's asking, is there any chance to bring some sanity into config export by not exporting anything that is the same as in the config install of core modules? I assume this would reduce the number of files in the config directory quite a lot.
Do you want to take that question?
I guess I can. So at the beginning of the configuration management initiative, we struggled a lot to define like who owns the configuration, and what should happen when a module is installed, and then what should happen when the module changes its configuration after it's been installed on a site. And in order to make configuration deployments reliable, and in order to give sites control over their configuration, it's important that when a module is installed, the configuration moves from the module's install directory into the site and is then owned and controlled by that site. If we don't do that, then changes that a module author might make on update will appear automatically on a site without the site okaying it. They can't. There's no QA process that could say, yeah, that's what I want. And so, yeah, there is no plans to change that, because it would completely break the predictable nature of, here's my set of configuration. I'm going to be able to know exactly what my site is doing with that. So the full site export is the way it will be. Do you have anything to add on that, Fabian?
No, I think you summed it up very well. I also like in the beginning when we started working on Drupal 8, and we saw like this unwieldy amount of configuration in the same folder. We're like, oh no, we need to like make this more organized. But I learned over these years that actually you're not meant to edit these files manually. You're not meant to organize them in another way. They're just there as a, like, you can treat them as an opaque kind of export, and they're in nice files so that Git can help you resolve merge conflicts. But if you don't think about them as this big folder of files, and as long as you don't have like millions of them, I think it should be fine. There is, on the other hand, a contrib module by Czechs who separates the config files depending on, like, for example, I think it separates the fields out of like the node display configuration or something like that, to reduce basically diffs. But I haven't used it myself. I just saw it and I was like, this is a very neat trick. But yeah.
So we have another question from Sven, who's asking us, what do we think of the Thunder approach, using update helper to generate update hook ends and providing expected config and new config in own YAML files. It's essentially applying a diff on top of your current configuration.
I think that it's a very interesting approach, and this is what I was referring to before. It's one of the ways. Thunder is a distribution, and it's one of the ways how distributions can manage their configuration. And I think the update helper is really good because this diff includes what the expectation is, because the configuration on the site is owned by the site, but as a developer of the distribution, you want to be able to update the configuration on the site, of course. And I think it's a great idea. It's a different mindset from who controls the update process. In the Thunder approach, the developers of the distribution control much more the process. And since they run as update hooks, you as a user of the distribution don't have much choice over what is being imported or what is being run as update hooks. Of course, you need to do this on the development environment, and you can check it, and then you can do the config export and config import, and as part of the Drush deploy hook, you will probably override the configuration again if you didn't agree with the change, since the update hooks come before the configuration import.
We've got another question from Jean-Baptiste. Do you have any advice for configuration tracking with Git when trying to keep a pre-production environment as close to a production environment? Is it possible to use it for automated configuration deployment from one environment to another?
I would say yes, that's the whole point, right? Like, that's also my recommendation, is keep the configuration that's in Git as close as possible to the one that you want to have on production. And this will also not change with the config environment module that we are trying to add to core. There's actually some edge cases that with updates in particular that could potentially be an issue, or we have to like find a solution to it. But I don't know if it will happen, because config split currently has the same problem and nobody actually complained about it so far. So I don't know how theoretical this is, or if it's actually really happening. Yeah.
And we have another question from Hao, which is, what is the current state of config split on Drupal 9 and Drush 10?
It works, at least according to the test. We run, so config split, the 1.x works both with Drush 10 and Drush 9, and Drush 8 even, and it works on Drupal 8 and Drupal 9. And config split 2, as any other module that uses the new core API, needs to run on Drush 10. So like Drush 10 is like the default, and we have tests that make sure the config split also runs on Drupal 9. So I think that's the answer.
And we've got a few seconds left. So we've got one more question from Guillaume. Yesterday during GitLab presentation, the presenter was using drush config set commands to update some config instead of using config split modules. What do you think during a deployment?
I think drush config set is not made for using during a deployment, because that's what the configuration that you export is for. Like drush config set sets some configuration, and that should be like what is exported in the configuration in the sync directory. But of course, if you want to change what configuration is live on your production side as part of the deployment, and you have like this conditional drush config set as part of the deployment script, then yeah, that's one way of doing things, of course, which means that when you then run config import afterwards, it will be overwritten again, like it will go away, whatever you set. It's kind of like in the features days when the feature was overwritten and you would like what was it, feature update, I think. You would get rid of the configuration that you set explicitly. And with config filter or the config split, what it does is it makes it part of the configuration import. And so every time you import it, it will stay the same. It will keep the same values.
Sorry for interruption, but time is finished.
All right. Thanks. There is no more questions. So thanks for attending, and
Thank you very much.
thanks to Alex and
Thanks
Mort for
all.
the support and help in the presentation.
Bye.